This is the Horse Radio Network.
You're listening to The Stall and Stable Show, ideas for happy horsekeeping.
Welcome to Stall and Stable's new series, Barns with Blackburn, featuring renowned architect and author, John Blackburn. In this series, John shares his expansive knowledge about farm planning, design, and construction, from the basics of site selection to details that make barns safe, beautiful, and highly functional for our needs. Our goal is to leave you both inspired and informed. So listen in. This is episode 92 of the Stall and Stable Show, and the first episode in our special series, Barns with Blackburn. I'm Helena Harris, and I'm delighted to welcome as my co-host, John Blackburn. Many of you may know John's work as a premier equestrian architect, and, well, to know his work is to love his work. If this name is new to you, I suggest you head over to Facebook or Instagram and search for Blackburn Architects. There you will find many examples of barns and farms that illustrate John's unique vision for healthy, functional farms. Hi, John, and welcome to the Stall and Stable family.
Hi, Helena. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I want to talk to you about what you've been up to recently, and then a little bit about your plans for the future and why you're here.
All right. Well, happy to do so. But I guess after 40 years of designing for horses, I've decided it's time to begin a transition to what I call semi-retirement. I say semi because it's not really retirement. I just love doing what I do too much to ever retire. And that's the long and the short of it. I will be continuing to work with my staff, who will be taking over the reins, so to speak. Plan to continue to work with them in designing horse farms, imparting a little of my 40 years of experience to them. But also I want to try a few new things that have really long interest in me. This podcast is an example of trying a new thing. During the pandemic, I've been following podcasts and webinars and so forth, but I decided, well, it's time for me to do a little of my own. And I'm very interested in sharing what I've learned over 40 years and doing what essentially is about 400 horse farms.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is.
Do you ever get sick of it? Are you ever like, I can't talk about planning anymore?
Not at all. In fact, what I'm doing now is I'm transitioning into something that's a little different. It's designing sustainable green horse farms. Because over my career, I focused on the design for the health and safety of the horses. And I want to continue to do that, but I want to design for the improvement of the environment through horse farms. And my focus has been on balancing the health of the horse with what I call the goals of the owner and what I would call the demands of the site. But now with climate change and our growing concerns for the environment, I want to focus my attention on those. It's the equestrian, the economy, and the ecology. And you need to balance all three of those. And that's what a sustainable horse farm does. It balances and improves all three E's, if you will.
A horse farm is the perfect laboratory to experiment with ways that we can be more eco-friendly.
Right.
Leave a smaller carbon footprint, but also to be efficient. There's a lot of organic matter that's consumed and created.
That's right.
On a horse farm, and a lot of natural materials that we can make use of. So there's just more flexibility, I think, in a horse farm where we can experiment with things like that.
And the key to that is that every site is different. Once you solve a problem, you could go into, say, a chain restaurant or motel, and they're all the same. They just create a site and put them there. But every horse farm you do is different. That's why I love doing what I do so much. It changes. People have asked, why don't I just do it where I live, which is design horse farms around the middle Atlantic. But I've learned over 40 years that that's what's exciting, is that all the areas are different, all the plants are different. Horses tend to be the same, but you got to design each one for each site.
That statement is very timely because the last episode that we put out was with my guest lives in Texas. She was raised in eastern Montana, and now she has a small farm, 10 acres in Texas. And we were just talking about the differences, not only in how she keeps her horses, what her turnout is like, but even the types of materials that are available for fencing. And the United States is big and really geographically diverse. So you're right. How we create a horse's environment for the geography is going to be very unique. And that's fun, I think, at least for someone like you, that's fun.
Yeah, in fact, that's my recent book. Healthy Stables by Design is my first book. And equestrian design in America is another one, but it's in my book. I focus on 18 different farms I've done in all parts of the country. And what I try to do is explain to them, and then through the book, is how every farm is different, every location is different, and you're designing for the health and safety of the horse, but also now more so for the health and safety of the environment. And you bring them into balance. And that every time you do it, the farm changes.
Yeah.
The design changes. You could be across the road from another site, and in fact, I'm doing one now. I'm doing a sustainable farm now in Maryland that's across the road from the farm I designed maybe 15 years ago. And it's entirely different.
Interesting.
Because the environment's different. So there's a lot of things. And so that's what I do. It's fun.
Well, today's episode is going to focus on site selection for an equestrian property. And let's start with the Eastern Seaboard. And this is actually something that I am very interested in right now because my husband and I are looking at possibly acquiring some property in Aiken, South Carolina. And I'm learning a lot about site selection. So let's start with searching for land. Now, there's raw land, there's partially cleared land. What might someone look for when they're looking for uncleared land? Let's say we're looking at maybe a 7 to 10 acre parcel, and we're going to put maybe a small house and a barn. That's pretty much everyone's plan. What are some of the key things that we're going to look for in that site?
Well, there's 1,000 things to consider. That's the first thing. If it's raw land, it's covered with trees, right off the bat, so you're 2 years away from even starting pastures because you got to tear out the trees. The soil is all different now. It's very maybe acidic or different than what pastures need to be. So you get the pasture developed. And that's a lot of times when you're designing a farm, it's the season when you start and when you finish. And I always try to get people to get the site plan going, figure out where your paddocks are going to be. Then you can build a barn, but you've got to get those pastures started because that's going to take you at least 2 years. 3 years would even be better. So if you've got raw land with trees and it's covered with trees, which is going to be great because trees are good. Forested land is good for the environment, but you need to be selective where you use it and how you're going to use it. And it's going to take 3 years to probably get that to pasture. So I would say do that and maybe start your barn planning within that year, but you got to figure out where it's going to be.
Where the barn's going to be.
That's right.
Coming from the Northeast and then looking at property down south, heat is an issue. And I thought, it would be better to buy a piece of property that's already cleared or partially cleared. But what I found is that shade is the most important thing for maintaining cooler temperatures in southern climates. And not a lot of people clear lots with that in mind. Maybe they leave a couple of trees, but they certainly don't leave them in a way that creates permanent shade, right? Where the horses can find truly cool areas even on the hottest of days. So I came away from that research day like, okay, maybe I want land that's not already cleared so that I can choose what kinds of trees I want to leave and where. Good idea or not a good idea?
It can be, depends on where the trees are. You can always create run-in shelters to give shade for horses, but trees are nice. It adds to the aesthetics of the property. The trees are nice in that it provides for other types of wildlife, natural grasses and different things like that. And it's carbon sequestering, so it's all very helpful. So I would say don't look for something that's bare land. I mean, you can always build a run-in shelter, but that's a cost. And if you can use the trees that are there, design the farm and lay out the farm in a way that it provides shade, but it doesn't create problems. You want to tend to fence your trees off from your horses because they will chew on them and gnaw on them. And also you got to be very careful what kind of trees there are.
Yeah.
There's a lot of toxic plants out there that you need to be very careful for. So that's just as I said, there are 1,000 or more things you need to consider. It's in the site as well as in designing the buildings. And when I walk onto a property, I look at the property, I look at the topo, and I start to begin to look at other aspects of it, ponds and trees and all those sort of things. And I get a feel for it. Based on some basic program needs that the owner has told me, I can begin to feel where this needs to be. And I sort of euphemistically tell the client, your farm is here. We just got to find it. It's in the soil, and we just need to find it. It's someone says like what Michelangelo said about sculpture. It's there. You just have to pull it out.
Are there ever times where someone has their heart set on a piece of property and you're like, no, yeah, there could be a farm here, but it's going to take X amount of time and X amount of dollars to carve it out and it's not worth it? Does that ever happen?
It doesn't happen too often. Most of the people who come to me know a bit about horses already, but I remember going to look at a horse farm over on the eastern shore of Maryland at one time, and it was about 6 inches of water across the land. And I said, unless you pull in truckloads and truckloads of dirt and raise the grade of this property, you're going to be in mud the whole time. And so he finally realized it didn't work and he got rid of that property. But yes, but it didn't happen very often. I look at a property and try to figure out what's the right balance between horses and the environment, and how do we make this work? Because you're looking at topo, you're looking at wind, you're looking at sun, you're looking at trees, you're looking at the soils. There's so many things you need to consider. And that's what we do, is look at all those and try to evaluate the best place to place the barn.
When we do finally build that barn and we set up our farm, I don't think anyone really plans to say, well, we're going to fix this in 3 years, or we're going to fight that battle in 5 years. We kind of want to set it up and be done and just enjoy our horses. But that really requires serious planning, like very detailed step-by-step planning on the front end. Otherwise, every year is going to be a series of projects that you're doing to mitigate what you didn't plan for in the beginning.
Right.
So site selection, it's really not as critical as one might think if you've got someone who can help you with the site plan, right?
Yeah, I'd say so. Depends on who's helping you. I mean, I like to think I'm experienced at this, and I've done enough horse farms to know. But, a lot of people will go to some sort of a design build barn builder, and he's there to sell you a barn. He's not there to choose the best place. He's not there to look at where you're going to be in 5 or 10 or 15 years. He's there to sell you a product.
Yeah.
What we do is we sell a service, or we're helping you figure out what you want to do. One of the first things we do is we develop probably about a 20-page questionnaire that asks everything about the farm, from how many bucket hooks you want in the corner of that stall to how you turn out your horses. And that paints a picture of exactly what I need to know for you to have the horse farm to work to your dreams and to your land. And then our process is putting those two together.
So when you get this feedback back from the client, what's the first thing that you look at when you go to sit down and start to create a site plan? Where do you start?
I start with, two things. I'll look at the program, which we put into like a program matrix. Then I'll start looking at the site and do a site analysis. So I have to understand the site, understand their program, and hopefully I already understand the horse. So my goal, as I said, is balance. It's to pull those three things together. And so it really all sort of comes up together. It's not one or the other.
Well, what's in the site analysis? Soil? Do you start with trees? Do you start with?
I start with a topo. I look at the location where the farm is, like you said, in Aiken, South Carolina. It can get pretty hot. You have a lot of clay in the soil down there. You can have some very flat property, but you can also have some very rolling property, which I think is best for horses. And
you think the rolling is better for horses?
Absolutely. They get better exercise. Running up and down hills can be very helpful. It can be very steep and it can be problematic, certainly in the winter if there's ice and snow on it. But all these things you take into consideration. That's why I said one site is very different from another. I mean, if you're in New England, you've got conditions you need to be careful of, and then in South Carolina, you have others. It's different all over the country.
What kind of situations would someone want to steer clear of on a piece of property?
Well, there's so many things, but one, rock outcroppings can be a problem because you've got to fence those off. Wetlands can be a problem. Not that you can't necessarily get away from, but you need to fence them off. You got to look at how you've got wetlands, you've got rock outcroppings, you've got forest areas. You want to balance all those, but you want to have enough land for your horses to be horses and have pastures. Then you got to think about what your horses are doing. What are you doing with your horses? Are they turned out 24/7? Are they turned out 2 hours a day? Are you working with them every day so they're getting exercise? Are they getting exercise in their paddock? You're turning them out individually. You're turning them out in a herd. There's all these various things that come together, and that's what the programming does. It tells me how you want to run your farm which tells me how the land and the farm need to work together.
I'm going to assume you look at aerial shots.
Absolutely.
Okay. And then thinking about, okay, the pastures are going to go over here, the riding ring will go over there, the barn over here, the house over there, the driveway is going to come through here, the water's going to run off on this slope. Is that kind of how does that come into play when you're planning?
All that comes into play. There's just so many things that comes into play. It's hard to, it certainly can't begin to cover them all on this one podcast, maybe not even 50 podcasts, but there's a lot to consider. And I used to think earlier in my career that how simple this could be, and then start to see what mistakes other people make. I go into so many farms and I see problems, and I realize it's complicated, because you're not just designing a building, you're designing a site to go with that building, to go with your desires and your needs. You got the operation of the farm, you got the expense of the operation. I mean, I tell a story about, I was on a farm in Kentucky, where I went to see the farm manager about designing a barn. And there was a groom working with a horse, and I said, "Where's the so-and-so?" And he said, he's pointing way out into the field. He says, "He's out there. He just led 2 horses out to the paddock, and he's going to come back." So I waited for him, but I waited probably 10 minutes for him to lead those horses back. Then he had to take 2 more horses, which he gave to the groom to take out, and then we could start talking. Point was, the paddocks were not laid out close to the barn. I mean, there was time wasted going to and from a paddock. And there's just so many concerns that you need to think about. Not just that, it's for feeding, it's for taking care, it's for monitoring your horses. For example, a simple thing is having a paddock close to the barn where if you have a fire, you turn those horses loose, you get them into that paddock, and you just let them go. Because they're going to be freaking out. You're going to be freaking out. So you don't want to let them run out down the road. You got to get them somewhere.
We're going to talk about some design ideas going forward for different scenarios. And we're always going to keep in mind efficiency, because that's one thing that horse people just never have enough of,
Right.
which is time, right? And then safety. So efficiency, safety, health of the horses, as you say, and now environmental sustainability. Let's go into a little bit of detail. Driveway access. Whether we have a house that exists already, maybe this is a project we're undertaking, or we're planning this from scratch. What are some things for us to keep in mind when we are planning automobile access to both a house and a barn? I know a lot of people forget that I was one. I remember, oh God, my barn and my driveway had horrible access, and I was hauling bales of hay with a wheelbarrow in 3 feet of snow in New England because I couldn't get my truck up into the barn. So what are some things that we need to consider so that doesn't happen to people?
Well, again, there's so many things to consider. Let's start with the entrance. Looking at the entrance, you want to think about coming and going from the farm, the speed on the highway, visibility, horse trailers, semis, whatever, pulling in and out. They've got to have turning radiuses. So those are critical. But then once you get on the farm, one of the first things I do in planning is, how do you separate people, horses, and vehicles? They all need to come together to do their task, but you want to separate them. The type of services for vehicles is not horse friendly, and it's not environmentally friendly in many cases. So you need to think about that. You want to think, how do you keep the roads to a minimum? Because that's a costly improvement to the property.
Yeah.
So all those things come together, and you think about the location of the roads. What are the roads made of? One of the things that's sort of interesting when I work with horse farms is they put a hay barn in the mix of the buildings. But how do you get the hay truck, which might be a tractor trailer truck, into that farm? How do you turn it around and get it out? And you want to do it with as little road as possible. You want to preserve as much land as you can. If you only have 10 acres and you have 10 horses, you need to preserve as much land as you can. So let's not chew it up with roads. Roads create drainage problems. So there's so many things to consider, but I don't know if I'm answering your questions, but I could ramble all day.
Well, no, we're looking for just some things for horse owners. Like, what should I even think about, or conversations they need to have with their architect or their builder. I'm a fan of gravel driveways, natural driveways. I'm not a fan of paving if I don't have to, especially on a farm. Or do you have a preference for one or the other, paving access points or not?
Well, paving is at a minimum, because once it's costly, it's not horse friendly, and it's expensive. Another thing about planning is how do you separate? Well, you want to separate horses and people and vehicles. But in vehicles, you have farm vehicles, you have visitors, you have service vehicles. Service vehicles may need a hard surface where you may want gravel and a certain type gravel if you want to have horses on it. All that needs to be considered. And so I would look at one, minimizing where horses, vehicles, and people cross. You want them to come together. You want to keep the surface type roads to a minimum because that's going to affect the drainage, the environment, the safety of the horse. And so all those things in a factor. Where you place your facilities on the farm is a function of how it's going to operate and where the farm. For example, I tell people sometimes, well, the logical place to place a barn in a, let's say, a 10-acre field in Kansas would probably be right near the middle because it's equal service to all areas of that farm. But if you're locating where the service is going to be, the hay barn, you may want to put it closer to the road because that's where the truck is going to come in, service, and leave. So then you think about where the barn and the hay is. So you got to get the hay to the barn. So you want those to sort of come together. So then you start to look at the land. If it's perfectly flat, it makes it a boring farm, but it also makes it simpler, I guess. But if you're looking at rolling land, you got trees, you got streams, you start to look at all those elements that have an impact. And that's where the site planning really is critical. I was at a farm the other day that has 800 gallons of water running across it from a spring every hour. 800 gallons. And it's a river. And so in the years past, they've put drainage tile in there to get it away. And what we're looking at now is how can you take that water, and this is what I like, that's what I love doing, turning lemons into lemonade, is how do you take that water and use it? Not just get rid of it, because it's there, it's free. And so what we're trying to look at now is how can I create a little micro hydro project to sort of use it to generate power to run the farm.
Wow. I mean, that is a lot of water.
That is a lot of water.
Yeah.
And what they're trying to do is get rid of it. But the ground is so wet. It's a problem. And so that's an example of, and I don't know, it's sort of departed from your subject, but it's taking the site, what's unusual about that site, and using it to your advantage. Best management practices is a good key. You use best management practices to guide you. And I've always stressed that water is the key. That affects almost all the other best management practices, but how you handle them is different. For example, how you handle one best management practice in South Carolina and Aiken might be very different than you do in New England, certainly different than you would have in California.
When you said that, 110 different episodes came up in my mind, from soil composition to options for water drainage, how we can reuse a lot of the natural materials that we have on site, manure, water. I mean, even rain barrels. I'm always looking for a way to capture the rain up here to either water my horses or water our gardens or water our ring in particular. And, my property in New England is, thankfully, it's on a slope. It's on a natural slope. So everything drains essentially to the ocean, to a salt pond. And so how can I make use of that gravity?
Yeah.
Capturing water and letting it flow down to a point where I can then use it to water my ring, my outdoor ring. So little things like that, although that's not so little, those are the kinds of problems that you really like to dig into. Tell me what you want to do, show me your property, and I'll figure out a way for you to get from point A to point B.
That's right.
So this is just a high-level overview of the kinds of things that we want to think about for site selection. We have a few more minutes here. I want to talk about fencing. Fencing is also, or the type of fencing is also very dependent on where you are in the United States. So up here in Rhode Island, we have very rocky soil. So I have to be really careful. I have to think about how deep I can sink my posts, what material I want to use, what the water content of the soil is like, because wood posts are going to rot in a short amount of time, right? We've got freeze thaw to think about. Tell me about fencing and what we need to think about in terms of fencing our properties when we're selecting a site for our farm.
Well, there are a lot of things to think about. Cost is one of them, and the amount of fencing you need. And that comes down to the layout of the farm and how you want to do it and where your farm is located. For example, if you're on a highway, you need double fencing, certainly around the highway.
Yes.
You look at if you got a lot of trees,
Preferably a 10-foot concrete wall.
whatever. But you do have, and then you have trees on the property or along the property that could fall down and break the fencing. But I like natural dark wood fencing because if you look across the field, you see trees. The trees are dark. The fencing is dark and you don't see the fencing as much. It sort of blends into the landscape. The horses will see it, but that's how you design a fence and how you place it on the property, how you design the paddocks is also very critical. Selecting the fencing is a cost. It's a maintenance factor. And the materials, and yes, the rocky soil can have an impact. It seems like most people, I've put wood fencing in properties all over the country, and they find a way to do it, but I just prefer that. I have not specified plastic fencing very often. I do it occasionally when a client wants it because they're concerned about maintenance. And I can understand that because fencing is one of your annual expenses on a farm. You got to go around there and police it and improve it.
What do you suggest as a minimum height?
About 54 inches is a minimum height. It's also, you depend on the type of horses and where you are. For example, if a horse is on top of a hill and they see that fence at the bottom of the hill and they see a barn on the other side, they say, man, I'd like to go jump that fence and to the barn. And so you got to think about the height of the fence, where you place the fence. And so that's where I like to think that our value comes to bear.
I came back from Florida recently, and in all of my trips to Florida and many down south, I've noticed that the board fencing is ubiquitous with the no-climb wire mesh. And some people use 4-board fencing. Some people just use the top board with the no-climb, which I understand is, I don't even know. Do they use it because that's just what they do, or is it actually more affordable?
It's actually not. You're referring to what I call that sort of diamond mesh.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the best fencing. Because of that, you can use it to sort of limit the amount of animals that are crossing the property if you want to do that. For example, the neighbor's dogs that come in and chase your horses, something like that.
Yeah.
The no climb is helpful, but it's actually more expensive. Maybe less to maintain, but it's more expensive to install. Everybody loves the 3 or 4 board, is what I like. It looks good. They're rolling around the landscape, and it's just beautiful.
It is, and it does. It fits with the aesthetic, with a natural aesthetic. The dark 4-board is really nice. And then I'm going to wrap up with some neighbors and zoning issues when we're looking at a site for our farm. We have to think about that. We have to think about who lives next door to us and what the rules and regulations are for our property and what we want to do. What do you suggest to people who, what kinds of thinking do they need to do around those things?
Well, it's different in every state and every location, but zoning and setbacks and right-of-ways are all very critical. You need to know that. If you're looking to buy a horse farm or farm some locale that you're not living in, I would actually subscribe to local newspapers, find out about where things are going, find out if you've talked to various horse owners in that area, find out what's happening. If there are issues at bear, you want to also look where you are relative to a city or a town, neighborhoods, schools, because you're going to have little kids want to come, let's go pet the horses, or let's go feed the horses. You need to think of all those. And it's just a lot to think of, but you also want to think, well, if I'm on the edge of the city, am I going to have the zoning, the tax structure to be able to maintain my farm? Or am I going to have to sell it for development at some point? I don't want to do that. A concern of mine is that we keep more horse farms closer to the city so people who live in the city can have access to horses without driving 30, 40 an hour away to ride their horse. I'd like to bring horses back into the city, back into the suburbs. And that's where zoning and being aware of zoning and how you can plan it. And that's where a lot of the urban planning boards are unfamiliar with it. They just don't know. And they just say, oh, they'll look at a housing development and they'll say, there's tax dollars at work. It's helping us. But if you look at that versus the cost of having a horse farm and what it brings in the economy, this is where those 3 E's come back, the economy. Because when you have a horse farm, it looks vacant. A lot of people look at it and say, this is a place to build our school. This is a place to build a shopping center. But I look at it and say, well, this is a place that you have farriers, you have vets, you have people, you have all the various people that are supporting that farm, that are supporting the economy. And there's no infrastructure or very little infrastructure. So it's not costing the county or the city much of anything, and yet it's benefiting. And it's adding an aesthetic look. All those people in the city that are driving by this vacant land, that's a breath of fresh air. And we got to keep that. I work with ELCR, Equine Land Conservation Resource, and preserving land and maintaining it for horse people to use. I find that beneficial for all of us. People are not horse people. It's just, you drive through a horse country in Kentucky. I mean, they have tours just for people going around looking at the farm. They don't own horses. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's what we will need to maintain and bring those horses back into the city or back into the suburban areas where people can be close to their horses and enjoy them.
I never would have even thought of that. And now that's a rabbit hole I'm going to have to go down when we're finished recording this episode.
We'll do that on another podcast.
Do you ever recommend, or have you ever found yourself having conversations with neighbors before construction begins? Like, okay, client of mine, we really need to sit down with your neighbors and talk about what's going to happen. Do those usually go well, or what's your advice for making sure they go well?
Well, that's a tricky answer, but what I'm always trying to do, and it's usually worked out very well for me over the years, is my goals are generally the same as the neighbors. They like it. We've had a project just recently in California where we had the neighbor, and it's in a horse community, but the neighbors one neighbor in particular was up in arms about it because they were going to lose their sunlight or lose their views or whatever. And so I take that into account. And I think that's part of the site restraints. We need to work with that. And we can you want the neighbors to be happy and to enjoy your horse farm as you want to enjoy the land that you're using. So it's a balance that you have to go through. But yes, we bring in the neighbors' concerns periodically, as well as with zoning boards, planning committees.
How do you have that conversation? I mean, is it something like where you go over with a pot of coffee and you knock on the door and say, hey, we're going to be building a farm here? What does that look like?
Start with, I would say, the local jurisdiction. And
you go through the town.
I go through the town, you talk to them, you say, all right, what are your concerns? Because this is what we want. We're not here to fight you. We're here to work with you because I know what their concerns can be. And I want to use that to the advantage of the farm and to them. And then if there's going to be an issue with a neighbor, then I would like to see the client who owns the property, the farm we're working with, begin that discussion. And then we have a meeting. It's best it comes from the owner, not from me.
Yeah.
But it could be either way, but we'll have discussions.
But you can help inform and educate the owner so that they can bring these valid points to the discussion. So
yeah, right. For example, I'll just give you an example, manure pits. They're going to say, I don't want to have that manure pit next to my property. And I can say, all right, we'll try to avoid that. But then here's different ways we can handle manure. We can compost it. We can do this. We can set up rules for how we manage the composting manure, how we leave it on the property, take it off the property. And that can be a point of bringing them together as opposed to, then you can create manure that can be composted and used in the area, or spread on the farm if that's not a problem. But it's got to be composted. Or you work with the neighbor and say, we're not going to spread raw manure on the property. How do you take care of that? Whether it's composting, where it's open composting in rows, or if it's in a pit or whatever, the different ways you can do it. We do there's a system we used put out by a company, O2 Compost, that they compost it and they design it for you to. It's generally 3 pits that you rotate, or you just put it in there and it degrades. And so it's very helpful for the owner to get the composting done off the site and less bulk, it's just so many benefits can come if you just think about all these elements and put them together.
We did an episode that featured the O2 composting systems. It's episode 35.
Right.
So for listeners, you can go back into our archive and find that about O2. John's right. Those systems are fantastic. We have to wrap up. We've run out of time for this episode. I think we're going to wrap up every one of these episodes with the same advice, which is you really need an expert to help guide you through this process. Even if you're already in the process, but you need help. I mean, we all need help. We all get stuck. And sometimes we don't know what we don't know. So consulting with an expert is really important. John is that expert. And going forward, you're going to be making yourself available to folks in that capacity as a consultant. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So tell our listeners where they can reach you if they're in the planning stages or if they do need help. How can they get in touch with you? And what kinds of folks are you able to talk to at this point?
I'll talk to anyone who's interested in horses and horse farms. But the best way is to contact me through my website, Blackburn Architects. Even though I'm semi-retiring, I'm going to be working with them, and it's going to be continuing. So that's the best way.
Excellent. Well, I will make sure that links to your website are available in this episode's show notes. In fact, I'll put them in the show notes, but I'm going to leave a link up on the Stall and Stable main website. So listeners, at any time, if you want to reach John or Blackburn Architects, you can hit that link. So we will be back next month with another one of these episodes. John and I will be talking about something that has to do with barn and farm design. John, thank you for being my co-host in this episode, in this series. I'm really excited about what we have to talk about in the future.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure. I look forward to more of them.
Well, listeners, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with John. This will be the first of 2 in this special series. It would be nice if we did more than 2. Well, that remains to be seen. If you like it and you'd like to hear more, be sure to let me know. Until next time, if you'd like to learn more about what Stall and Stable has to offer, go to stallandstable.com, have a click around, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I love to hear from listeners. And that's a wrap for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it.